The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Lord, to your
Jesus told his disciples this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out at dawn to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with them for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. Going out about 9 o'clock, the landowner saw others standing idle in the marketplace and said to them, "You too go into my vineyard, and I will give you what is just." So they went off. And when he went out again around noon and around 3 o'clock, and did likewise, going out about 5 o'clock, the landowner found others standing around and said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" They answered, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You too go into my vineyard." When it was evening, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Summon the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and ending with the first." When those who had started about 5 o'clock came, each received the usual daily wage. So when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also got the usual wage. And on receiving it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last ones worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who bore the day, burden, and the heat." He said to them in reply, "My friend, I am not cheating you. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what is yours and go. What if I wish to give the last one the same as you? Or am I not free to do as I wish with my own money? Are you envious because I am generous? Thus, the last will be first, and the first will be last." The Gospel of the Lord.
praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
My brothers and sisters in Christ, I would like to talk today a little bit about a virtue that all of us probably could practice a little bit better if we understood it a little bit better. It happens to be a virtue that I often like to make fun of, because if anybody who's ever driven out here on the main road during the busy weekends and the highway backed up and people cutting off in traffic and everything else, we've all kind of been flustered and frustrated and impatient and so on and so on. So we know the experience. So I want to talk a little bit. I always like to, pick on, this experience out here because it is so unusual. Not that people don't get stuck in traffic, but it seems to happen here quite often throughout the years. So I thought it might be a good idea to talk a little bit about patience and exactly what it does and how it is supposed to work within us. Even as much as I like to make fun of it, it is a fundamental virtue that we need to have in the spiritual life. In order, most of all, to have peace in the human soul, you've got to have patience. Well, before we take a look at that, if you're wondering what our parable is about today, the Gospel of Matthew is called the Gospel of Parables. There are many, many parables in this Gospel. And it's a way of communicating to the people a general expression which in the end can have several different meanings, or even more than several different meanings. But today, this is an expression, of course, that the landowner is none other than God himself. The vineyards is a human life, the human being who lives life. And what he gives to them, a daily wage to work in the vineyard, is salvation. The mystery of salvation. Now, not everybody comes to Christ at the same time of their life. We have saints, certainly, who never committed a single mortal sin in their lives, who came to God from the very beginning. From the moment they reached the age of reason, they never committed a sin. They followed God, loved God, and gave their life to Him. But then you have other people who come later on in life. Maybe some who have been close to God and then turned away from God. A lot of times that happens when a young person, let's say, leaves the family and moves out. They get away from God, they get away from the church, and they get away from Christ. And somewhere down the road, prayer and sacrifices hopefully will draw them back. But God always holds out to them the possibility of salvation. It doesn't matter what period of one's life that somebody comes to God. And I have, over the years, heard quite a few deathbed confessions. My first 2 weeks after being ordained, I was called to a home to give the last rites to a couple that had been diagnosed. Of course, they had cancer. And interesting of it being is this couple had the identical illness, were both identically in the same place as far as their illness goes. And supposedly, the doctor literally said they're going to probably die right around the same time, which is very unusual, but it happens. So I went to their house and heard their confession. It's the first thing that we did before we anointed them and gave them communion. And they shared with me, both of them, that there hadn't been a Mass, confession, or the sacraments in over 52 years. When they made their confession, it was sincere. They both wept. How sad they were for having wasted their lives, for having lived their lives only for themselves, not for God, for not giving God room in their lives. Now they knew it. They were about to stand before God. And they were so happy that even in this period, in this moment of their lives, they could still have a shot at salvation. And as I gave them absolution, I just thought to myself for a moment, I said, wow, what a grace in the priesthood to bring that to a human being who's lived their life far away from God, but to be able to hold out to them salvation. This is the person that has stood by idle all day. They made no effort. They were too busy doing other things. And Christ too says to them, go into my vineyard. In other words, come home. Come to my church. And the pay is simply the gift of salvation, that you have the possibility of being saved. Now, sometimes I know in Christian understanding of eternal life, especially heaven, there's always this idea that somehow in heaven we're all going to be identical, we're all going to be in the same spot, in the same place, but that's not really how it goes. There's a whole lot more to the story, as I often like to tell people. In heaven, there are levels. And how much love the human being has in their heart when they die is the level that they will achieve, and that's where they will stay for all eternity. A person that has worked all of their lives to live the Christian life, to follow the laws of the kingdom of heaven, to be a disciple of Christ, will have a greater reward than a person who just comes to God at the end of their lives because they had no opportunity, or they took no opportunity to grow in holiness, to grow in faith, to grow closer in love for God, and so on, even though they have salvation. Yes, they will have salvation, but they will not have the same reward. As Christ tells us in the gospel, that there are many mansions, many resting places, literally if you translate the Gospel of Matthew, in the kingdom of heaven. Which literally is an expression, there are many, many different levels. So don't think for a moment, just because somebody, and I've heard the confessions of many, many people, prostitutes, murderers, you name it, at their moment of their deathbed, confessions and things, and I'm always grateful for the fact of having that opportunity and that they can be saved. That the church has given that power and authority, that Christ has given that power and authority to his church. And I could pass it on to others, and then one day to look forward to seeing them in eternal life. but they're not going to have the same place as someone who has sacrificed all of their lives to live holiness, to draw closer to God. But that's literally what this parable is about today, simply. It's about that just wage for anybody who comes to the landowner, who comes to the church, to be restored to grace, to be restored to God. Now, the couple that I was talking about that I heard the confession, been away for 52 years, died within 1 day of each other 2 days later. Very unusual, but very interesting anyways. Let's talk a little bit about this particular virtue that I often like to make fun of: patience. Patience is a fundamental disposition of a brave and generous soul. A soul that loves. A soul that loves God and all the things that God has created. But yet it is the most difficult or more difficult virtue to put into place and to keep that virtue as a quality within one's soul. Now, over the years, many times people have come to me and say, "Father, I've been praying for patience for 20 years, and I seem to be getting worse instead of better." And I said, "Well, let me tell you a little secret about patience. Something you may have never known. No matter how much you pray for patience, God is not going to drop patience in your lap. That ain't going to happen. Virtues must be practiced on a natural level first. That means you have to make every effort possible on a natural level within your human nature and human capabilities of being patient. Which means I'm driving out on the highway out here, like I was like to use it as an example, because we all do it, in traffic, and somebody cuts me off, and even I've been given the IQ sign, the single IQ sign out there on the highway. That's what I call it, the IQ sign. It's well, you're just showing your IQ, but I always get them back and give them a blessing. That's my IQ for them. So that pays them back a little bit, so. But we all have that experience and have had those experiences, but we all have moments in our lives when we can be patient. We may not have heroic patience, a patience that is present at all times, to the point where one even dreams patiently. It's a virtue that must be established in the human soul through practice. Once one begins to practice it through trying it and falling and trying it again, falling, trying it, and so on, things get better. And I start out with little things. Somebody slams the door, and normally I yell at them. Well, how come I just don't say nothing? I've said it 1,000 times, stop slamming the door. Why get impatient? Say nothing. Maybe my husband comes home from work, he kicks off his shoes and socks and throws them in the corner. I told him 1,000 times, stop doing that. Why say anything? These are little things. Little opportunities. There's thousands of them that we have in our lives. Each one of us has different opportunities. I'm trying to watch the football game and the kids are running around making noises, screaming, and so on. I literally want to let them have it. But why can't I just be patient, let them be kids? You see, once I begin to practice patience, God will begin to infuse His grace into that part that I have done. Out of that, it becomes a sanctified virtue. In other words, it sanctifies me. And it allows me to grow in patience to the point of becoming heroically virtue. Who's the greatest hero of the virtue of patience? Christ. His entire life was the virtue of patience. Having to deal with so much and so many people. patience. But all forms of impatience, anger, resentment, resistance to circumstances, fuss, stress, are all ultimately born out of self-love, selfishness. A person who is impatient is a person who can't put God first. Patience really is a primary virtue, just like humility. If I ever want to have peace, I've got to learn how to be patient. And I'm not talking about peace externally. I'm talking about peace interiorly. A peace inside, in the middle of all the noises and the distractions and the difficulties and the brokenness of human life and the brokenness of human beings that I'm around every day, whether it's my family members, whether it's friends, whether it's work, whether it's school, it doesn't matter. To be even tempered at all times. As one of the great mystics of the 12th and 13th century said, patience is a peaceful, indifferent endurance for the sake of God of all that can happen. Nothing does so much to deepen and steady the soul's spiritual life. It is a virtue that the Christian soul misses today. People will fight over the smallest, little, minutest little detail. I remember one time our vocation director came to our seminary. And he said, wait until you get into a parish. You're going to be surprised what disturbs people. And he told us a story about he had to change the curtains in the parish hall. So he brought it to his parish council. Somebody wanted this color, somebody else wanted this color, somebody wanted that color, and so on. And nobody could agree on any color. The color that he wanted to put up, nobody could even care less. In the end, they began to argue. They would call Father. They would come to his office. Father, we need this color because it'll look better, and so on and so on. And Father said it caused such a great commotion that he decided one night at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to hang the curtains. He bought him his color, the color he wanted, and he hung them. When the people came in for the weekend mass and they went into the parish hall, the curtains were hung. Nobody said a single word. Nobody complained. They were just there. Why all the fuss? But that's what happens. We like to put ourselves forward. And therefore we become impatient. And like I've often said, you can drive down this main highway out here about 5 times. If you could learn just to be quiet and to let nothing externally frustrate you, to enter internally, you'll have a little bit of patience. It's a beginning. But we need the whole virtue. I need to be patient at all times, not just at certain times. There are many different ways of being holy. Look at our saints. We have all kinds of saints, they had different virtues that were dominant in them. They're all saints. But the interesting thing of it being is, every single one of them had patience. We can't get away from it. If we're going to love God and grow in holiness, we have to have it. It's one of the most impressive virtues in the saints. The unassuming spirit of acceptance in the ups and downs and sufferings of life. In the saints, we don't see any agitation. Even St. Paul, often in conflict within his own Christian circle, ill, weary, and overdriven with the possible demands made on him. and often struggling through many bitter and severe conflicts, he shows patience. And Christ is, of course, the most patient one of all. He hangs on a cross and he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. An act of mercy, yes, but grown out of a heart that is patient and loving. And that's what we need to do as Christians as well. This patience needs to be present within all of us at all times. We oftentimes get so distracted because we're living in a time, especially when we're always in a hurry. We're always going from point A to point B. We set a schedule for ourselves. When we get up in the morning, I got to do this, I got to do that, I got to do that. And therefore, I'm on the run. When I get home in the evening, I got time to cook dinner, and I can literally drop dead on the bed. And God willing, hopefully I'll wake up the next day and start all over again. I don't have time for prayers. I don't have time for peace. I certainly don't have time to be patient. I have all these people in my lives that cause so much distraction. People who are sick for sensation and entertainment. People who ask foolish questions. People who like to put themselves forward as being self-important. And then we develop a dislike of interruption and silly or unnecessary demands on our valuable time. Patience allows us to be silent. How much ignoble fear and lack of generosity contribute to our impatient responses to life. We oftentimes are afraid that people may think that there's something wrong with us because we're patient. How we dread to resent derisions and wither up over critical or sarcastic words. We immediately have to defend ourselves. Especially if someone in my life that I know says something to me I don't like, and I immediately stand up and I tell it like it is. And over the years, we develop a particular way of reacting to each other. We become impatient with each other. We see this in married life. We see this in friendships. We become impatient with people, and we do that for years and years and years, and we tell ourselves it's okay, when in reality it's not. It's not. Patience is infinitely noble and worthy. It is a strengthening thread that runs through the supernatural spiritual life. If we have no spiritual life, who cares? If we have no prayer life because we're too busy, what does it matter? We're never going to have patience. So we have to learn to develop these things, and patience is only one virtue. But the interesting thing about the virtue of patience, it crosses over top and enters into 3 of the 4 cardinal virtues that the human being is supposed to have. The cardinal virtue of temperance, fortitude, and justice. The cardinal virtue of temperance, to control myself, not to allow people or others to control me, or my own weaknesses to take control of me. The cardinal virtue of temperance has to be there in order to have patience. The cardinal virtue of justice, to do what is just towards others. These are human beings created by God who have weaknesses, but I have to be just towards them at all times, at every moment of my life and every breath that I take. The cardinal virtue of fortitude, certainly. Heroic patience to make the right decisions at the right time, and to be able to realize, just be silent. What does it matter? I've already said it 1,000 times. 1,001 ain't going to make any difference. We have to be patient towards God. The things that He allows in our lives. sometimes profoundly distracting and confusing. But we have to be patient towards God because all things come from His hand. It doesn't matter whether we realize it or not. We often have a tendency just to look at the world, look at worldly things in a worldly way instead of realizing that God is working. He's working in the life of that human being as well, or through these circumstances and so on and so on. And because I look at it simply from a worldly way, I don't see God's hand in it, so I become impatient. I have to learn how to be patient towards God in the way He allows things. I have to be patient towards others, their weaknesses, the ups and downs of life. The weaknesses that we see in other people that cause us so much unrest. How many marriages could have been saved? How many families could have stayed united? How many friendships could have continued on if there was one virtue that was present? Patience. That divorce would not have taken place. That friendship and that family would not have fallen apart. Because there would be patience in a soul somewhere. And that soul can bring that patience to the lives of other human beings. And then we need to be patient with ourselves and our own weaknesses. We need to honestly acknowledge and recognize our weaknesses for what they are. We can't always point the finger at everybody else. Sometimes I'm the one who disturbs others by my anger, by my words, by my unrest, by my impatience. We all can do it. So as I often remind people, look at yourself first. Don't worry about other people. Being patient is easy when one lives alone. But if you're living in a community environment, a family and so on, or you work and you have relationships and friendship and so on, it's completely different. Because the weaknesses of other human beings penetrates into our souls. And out of that comes our response. One of the interesting things of the Christian journey on earth was the ability to be transformed from the brokenness of what the human being is, to be restored in the virtues in the image and likeness of Christ. We're not supposed to allow the external world to penetrate into our souls. We're supposed to be humble enough and patient enough to allow it not to disrupt us interiorly, to always have peace and patience in every situation. Without patience, one cannot love God. We only fool ourselves. And that's why I always like to make fun of it. It's the way modern Christianity kind of treats it. People don't talk about it. You have to be patient. How many times throughout the years had the Lord used different people in my life, even in extreme circumstances, to teach me patience, to love the human being in the middle of his brokenness, even when he's red in his face with anger, breathing death threats down my throat, but to love them, to be good towards them, to give them a cup of cold water when they ask for it, even at the wrong time, to put up with the stupid and the quarrelsome, those that are hard of heart and obstinate, the prejudiced. Each one of us can fill these blanks in for ourselves if we can just learn to be patient. how much easier it would be to love God. The fever of impatience will leave us. We are sick if we have impatience. If you ask God to give you patience, be prepared for trials. God will send situations into your life so you can practice patience. That's what it means to pray for patience. He's not going to drop it in your lap. But He will give you the opportunities to practice it every day if you really want the virtue. It's the only way to have peace within oneself. It's the only way that one can be a peacemaker. Blessed are the peacemakers. You have to have patience. Patience is a work that has to be done in the wet, the cold, and the fog, in war and in peace, in weakness and in exhaustion, steadily, patiently, always. Lord, I have finished the work you gave me to do, not the work I decided to do for you myself.